Here's a question. If humans evolved based on survival of the fittest, then how do we account for empathy or altruism? Darwin said, "He who is ready to sacrifice his life would often leave no offspring to inherit his noble nature." So in this video, I'll explain the mechanism of how I think empathy and altruism emerged out of our inherent Darwinian selfishness. You can refer to my book, The Tangled Mind, for a detailed explanation, but the core idea stems from feature integration theory. An apple has many features: color, shape, size. When you see an apple, your brain follows two steps. First, it activates those features, then it combines those features into the coherent perception of an apple. Now, when you break down this process, you'll realize that object boundaries are very subjective. Here, you conceptualize the apple as a single object. However, you also could have conceptualized multiple objects within this apple, like the stem, the skin, the seeds, or on the opposing side, you could have seen this apple within a larger bowl of fruit. So here, the apple is just merely a component of this larger object. So from your brain's perspective, an object doesn't have definitive boundaries. It all depends on your conceptualization and how you construe and group certain objects. And based on that idea, we find a concept that I call convergent processing. Consider a bowl of oranges. Just like before, your brain activates features of those oranges, such as color, shape, and size. However, the bowl is part of this entity, so you activate those features as well, such as rigidity. At this point, your brain will bind all of those features into a coherent perception. But do you see the problem? Your brain is applying all of those features to this entity. During this process, you experience cross-contamination. By merely conceptualizing this bowl of oranges as one entity, you're injecting rigidity into those oranges. You'll perceive the oranges to be more rigid because of that contamination. Ultimately, when you perceive objects as a group, you merge these semantic traits as well. You can refer to The Tangled Mind for a more detailed explanation of convergent processing, but let's walk through a few examples. You can see this outcome in pricing. In one study, researchers displayed the price of an inline skate next to the benefit low friction. Here, those words, low friction, convey a small magnitude, and when those words appeared next to the price, people were more likely to buy the skate because they perceived that price to be lower. Their brain was converging that adjacent smaller magnitude with that numerical price. And I'm guessing that's why Amazon typically has a primary price with lower numbers underneath. Here, these adjacent magnitudes, $7.49 and 0, are unrelated to this price above. Yet by merely including those smaller magnitudes within the same vicinity, your brain groups all of those components, which in turn makes you perceive this actual price to be lower than it really is. Now, this concept occurs with objects, but it also occurs with people. If you see a neutral face next to somebody who is very attractive, will that neutral face seem better or worse? Well, it depends whether you perceive those people as a group or as two separate individuals. In one study, a neutral person seemed more attractive with the label of friends because participants conceptualized those two people as a unit, so they merged the attractiveness into that neutral person. However, that same neutral person seemed less attractive with the label of strangers because people conceptualized them as two separate objects. Now, where does empathy come into play? Well, we've been discussing principles of grouping, also called Gestalt principles, which influence whether or not we aggregate objects into a group. These concepts typically assume a third-person perspective of grouping external objects, but in order to see how empathy is involved, we need to move from a third-person perspective to a first-person perspective. You need to immerse yourself into one of those objects. If you conceptualize yourself and somebody else to be within the same group, your brain will remove the boundary that separates both of you as individuals. You'll experience the same contamination because of convergent processing. Your brain will desire to help that person because, from your brain's perspective, that person is you. If humans truly derive empathy by grouping ourselves, then every Gestalt principle of grouping should influence our empathy. So let's walk through a few examples. Similarity. If you see an array of dots, visual similarity will influence your grouping behavior. Here, you see 6 rows of dots instead of 36 individual dots. When objects look similar, you tend to group them. And unfortunately, humans experience the same effect with their own visual similarities, like skin color. It's well established that people unconsciously show more empathy toward people of their own race, and that happens because our brain intuitively groups ourselves with people of that same race. And you can also see this tendency in less obvious areas. There's a principle called the identifiable victim effect. People donated more money to save an African girl named Rokia compared to a statistic of millions of people, which would have included Rokia. In other studies, people empathize with animals in direct accordance with their anatomical similarity to humans. So in both cases, when people see a a human manifestation or something that resembles a human-like manifestation. This exposure resembles a Gestalt principle of similarity. We help people who are visually and conceptually similar to us because our brain is merging our identity with their identity. Any empathy or altruism is emerging from a motive that is unconsciously selfish. You can see the same effect with other Gestalt principles, like proximity. If you see two dots close together, you perceive them as a unit instead of two separate dots. Now immerse yourself into this dot. Suppose that two people die. One person lived across the world, while the other person lived across the street from you. Any death should be tragic, yet people feel stronger emotion toward this spatially closer person. Even if you've never met either individual, this closer proximity triggers stronger emotion because of your grouping behavior. Finally, another Gestalt principle is common motion. If you see two dots moving together, you group them, and this concept can explain the chameleon effect. Research shows that mimicry is very powerful. You like people when they subtly mimic your body language, and you also unconsciously mimic people who you like. Well, this mimicry is common motion. Your brain is merging yourself with those people. You like them because you are them. If this explanation is true, then the chameleon effect should reverse for people with low self-esteem. If people dislike themselves, then they'll dislike anybody who mimics their behavior because they're injecting that dislike into that person. Across evolution, empathy and altruism emerged as a byproduct of our selfishness. Some religious extremists oppose the ideas of Darwin. If humans are inherently selfish, then we wouldn't have the capacity for altruism. But these ideas aren't diametrically opposed. In fact, this concept could explain why every major religion has the same golden rule. Judaism, that which is hateful to you, do not do to your fellow. Hinduism, one should never do that to another, which one regards as injurious to one's own self. And you find the same doctrine in every major religion. Well, perhaps this doctrine is more literal than we thought. Perhaps this rule is so pervasive because it is the basis of human empathy. We care for other people because of our selfish nature. Without that selfishness, we wouldn't treat other people how we ourselves want to be treated. It's kind of like a poetic irony. Altruism can't exist without selfishness. Now, for the remainder of this video, I want to explain the practical implications and how we can use this framework to cultivate more empathy in society. When you break down the steps, you'll notice that two factors are required to feel empathy toward another person. Factor one, selfishness. Being selfish has a bad connotation, but it shouldn't necessarily be a bad thing. For example, I have a lot of respect for Mr. Rogers. He was a really remarkable guy that genuinely cared about the well-being of children. But if Mr. Rogers wasn't bullied as a child,
just before getting to adolescence, he got a good taste of what bullying was all about.
Would he still grow up to tell children what he himself wanted to hear as a child?
But it's you I like, every part of you.
Mr. Rogers was talking to those children, but his brain was talking to his younger bullied self. Consciously, he did feel genuine compassion toward those children. So it shouldn't matter whether his empathy was emerging from a deeper selfish mechanism. We should be judging people based on those conscious outcomes of that deeper mechanism. Now, hopefully you can see how selfishness, or at least self-esteem, would be a required component of empathy. In order to care for other people, you first need to care about yourself. If people dislike themselves, then they'll incorporate that dislike into other people. Evidence shows that many bullies have low self-esteem. In those situations, you can't say, hey, be nicer to other people. It seems counterintuitive on the surface, but in order to get those children, or even adults, to care about other people, you first need to get them to care about themselves. And the second factor is grouping. Even if we have good self-esteem, we still won't feel empathy toward other people until we conceptualize ourselves and other people to be within the same unit. Perhaps we could cultivate more empathy in society by improving this ability at sensory grouping in early education. Many people scoff at certain classes like art or music because they don't see the real-world application. However, even if children never explore art or music ever again, those classes might be enhancing their proficiency at sensory grouping, which would increase their ability at abstract grouping later in life. When they finally grow up, they won't distinguish people based on black and white or this difference and that difference. Future generations will have a more flexible mindset to see themselves as part of the same unit. They'll feel more empathy toward other people because of their enhanced ability to group themselves, all because of that enhanced sensory ability. With more research, I really think that these concepts could cultivate more empathy in society, but that won't happen if nobody is aware of these concepts. So post this video on social, share it with somebody else, talk to people about it. Also, empathy is just one application of convergent processing. If you want a deeper understanding of how sensory concepts influence not just empathy, but so many other aspects of our perception and behavior, you can read The Tangled Mind, which goes into so many other interesting examples. I'll put a link below, and I'll see you in the next video. If you see a neutral-faced. Now, this concept occurs with objects, but it also occurs with people. If you see, could you hear that horn? There was just a horn there. And these concepts aren't too alarming. I hope that doesn't get through. Okay.